What is your worst nightmare? Have you ever had a dream so terrifying it felt real? What if I were to tell you that your dreams could be fatal? The bastard son of 100 maniacs, Freddy Krueger was an orphan who endured a brutally abusive childhood. When he was only a teenager, he savagely killed his custodians. There, an inner darkness was set free within the young man. Amidst his adolescence, he'd grow up to become an infamous and ruthless child murderer, nicknamed the Springwood Slasher. Due to a mistake involving legal issues, Freddy was not sent to prison after being arrested. As such, the parents of Springwood took justice into their own hands, tracking Krueger down and burning him to death in his boiler room hideout. However, death was not enough to stop Krueger's crusade. He was offered a chance to wreak havoc once again through the power of dreams by a group of demons known simply as the Dream People. Freddy instantly accepted and began his crusade once again, this time as a vicious demon that could appear in people's dreams, empowered by their fear, causing pain and death in many creative ways. The effects of his dreams being a reality to those he terrorized, many people once again tried to stop Krueger and send him back to hell once again. In some cases, Freddy would even do battle more than once with two of the most infamous horror figures of all time, the machete-wielding Crystal Lake Reborn zombie, Jason Voorhees, and the boomstick-brandishing Ash Williams. However, while all attempts would initially seem successful, Krueger always found a way to come back, however long it took. After all, you cannot kill what is already dead. Prison is hell. Many men break once inside, but what happens to those who are already broken? Torque is a man of ill repute. Since his days as a child, he has been plagued by frequent instances of dementia and blackouts, courtesy of an alternate personality, Blackmore. Sentenced to die for the murder of his ex-wife and 2 boys, a crime he doesn't remember committing, Torque was admitted to Abbott State Penitentiary on Carnate Island. Once there, a tremendous cataclysm struck the island. As a result, hundreds of hideous creatures representing various forms of death ran rampant across the island. Faced with almost certain death, Torque battled his way across the island, and with some assistance from some unlikely allies, managed to escape and return to his home of Baltimore. However, he would discover that the same thing had happened there. Among the ongoing list of unanswered questions, he was once again forced to battle both the demons running the streets, as well as those that seep from within him in order to attain the truth from his evil alter ego. After many more conflicts, Torque and Blackmore battled for dominance of the one body they had been sharing for so long. How the battle concluded is not known. Some believe Torque was able to overpower his evil alter ego and achieve peace. Some say Blackmore achieved his goal and took control of Torque's personality, while others say that the two are still in a constant struggle to this day, with neither able to overpower the other. Regardless, Torque's story is one that tells a tale of mystery, insanity, and tenacity. After all, these are the ties that bind. For this year's Halloween special, we'll be using a composite version of both of these characters. For Freddy Krueger, this will include his appearances in the Nightmare on Elm Street movies, as well as his comic book appearances, but not the reboot. As a side note, this fight will be taking place in the standard Lovecraft dream world, making the contest a battle of willpower and creativity. Also, Freddy will not be in possession of the Necronomicon. For Torque, we'll be observing him during the events of the Suffering video games. Now then, let's get started on Freddy Krueger, the Springwood Slasher, versus Torque the Tormented.
Round 1.
As a being existing within the realm of the supernatural, It comes as no surprise that Freddy Krueger is not subjected to the standard limits of the mortal humans he terrorizes. Even when bereft of his powers, he still possessed greater physical traits than most could boast. In particular, his fortitude. The best example of this being the entirety of his second fight with Jason Voorhees, after being pulled into the real world. Throughout the contest, Freddy was frequently shown to be on the receiving end of Jason's physical might, having been tossed around and thrashed about by the brute. Considering the levels of strength Jason has been shown to possess, in regards to both how much he can lift and throw, as well as how hard he can hit, the fact that Freddy could keep fighting after being subjected to this sort of physical punishment is rather horrifying. In addition, towards the end of their fight, Freddy was impaled in the stomach and even endured the loss of an arm. Then the two were blasted into Crystal Lake by a nearby explosion. And despite Jason typically being shown to be the more durable of the two, it was Freddy who was first to pull himself out of the lake, finally being brought to his knees after being impaled one last time. When given proper access to his powers, Krueger became something much worse. When confronting Jason for the first time, he was able to augment his own strength to overpower the brute, and his physical resilience was further enhanced. He deliberately allowed himself to be dismembered of both his arms, only to regrow them near instantly. He would often use this as a way of intimidating his victims, allowing this sort of dismemberment or other disfiguration to happen, sometimes purely for the sake of his own amusement. His reflexes are the least defined out of all his physical traits, yet they were still passable. This was arguably his greatest advantage when he was forced to fight Jason in the real world, as taking Jason's strength head on would not have been the wisest of decisions. Jason may not be well known for his speed, yet he can still prove to be an unrelenting opponent given the chance. Of course, this doesn't mean that Freddy can't be beaten in the dream world, but his supernatural physical power will make him all the more difficult to overcome, and will force his opponents to think more creatively, should they seek their own survival. The limits of Torque's physical power aren't ever specifically defined, yet from what he does have, it is safe to say that a physical contest is something that he can handle very well. It has been noted by his ex-wife that he used to work and spar at a gym, ensuring that he kept his physical conditioning at its best, and this can be observed through his many accomplishments throughout the games. In an interview, the developers of the games would state that Torque was the guy who could take on an army of enemies and be ready for more.
Barely managed to survive. Torque is someone who can take on an army of creatures and blast them to bloody bits and then be ready for more.
And this was definitely the case with Torque. One of his fellow inmates on Carney Island, Clem, would state that he'd witnessed Torque take out packs of slayers and marksmen without so much as breathing hard. While this does speak to his skill at combating large groups of assailants, it also paints a good picture for his endurance. Over the course of both games, Torque is forced to fight his way through literally hundreds of enemies, both games of which happen over the course of a few undetermined days at most. If you get into a fight with Torque, the likelihood of you outlasting him is slim. As far as his physical might goes, Torque was known to have gotten into his fair share of fights and brawls in the past, on one occasion beating a thug to death with his fists. In fact, Clem would also witness Torque killing various monsters with his bare hands, but we'll go more in depth on that aspect later. Considering that he used to spar in some form of unarmed fighting, Torque's reflexes, while not well defined, were still acute in the few instances we've seen them. He managed to evade an attack from a slayer that had previously not been within his line of sight, and he even managed to rally after being thrown from a moving truck and crashing into a large crate. Finally, his resilience, while similarly vague, can still be inferred. As a brawler, he would have endured his own share of retaliative pummelings. He also somehow survived unharmed a long fall into Blackmore's drowning pool. Should his adrenaline kick in and his mood turn sour, his physical power is enhanced to an inhuman level, but this is something that deserves further detailing in another section, as it doesn't fall in line with his more common physical conditioning. While not as well documented as some other horror survivors, Torque's perseverance of the horrors that plagued the soil of Carnate Island and the streets of his hometown are without a doubt a testament to his own physical fortitude. A true one-man army. While Torque is not the most resilient of all foes Freddy has faced in his past, I feel confident in saying that he could at the very least endure some punishment from Krueger, considering how well he has held his own against the various monsters he has come across. However, there is still no denying that Freddy has the upper hand in this category. His strength and fortitude have been displayed at a more appreciable level on a more consistent basis than what Torque has. Of course, there is a way in which Torque can augment his own physical prowess to match Krueger, but this isn't something he typically starts out with, while Freddy can pull from this sort of physical power right from the get-go. Freddy Krueger is awarded the physical advantage.
Round 2.
In an effort to eliminate any confusion that I can in this category, I will only be going over what powers our combatants have here. I will be detailing the specific requirements and conditions for such abilities in the next category. But for now, let's take a look at what these guys can do once said requirements are put into place. Let's start with Krueger. Without delving too deep into the concept of how Freddy's powers work, they manifest themselves in the dream world, of course, as a form of lucid dreaming, i.e. the ability to take control of your dream, which is what Freddy attempts to do when terrorizing his victims. This implies that when he has access to his powers, the best way to describe Freddy is that he is essentially a reality warper. He can do virtually whatever he wants. He can wield telekinesis just as easily as he can teleport. He can alter his appearance and utilize metamorphosis attacks just as easily as he can create illusions, summon wild animals, change his size, and spawn inanimate objects. On occasion, he has been known to take control of people and even alter the look of the environment itself, typically favouring the look of his boiler room, but he'll also change the scenery to whatever he feels suits the situation. The most interesting thing about Freddy's use of his power is that he doesn't typically use an overwhelming destructive force of power to thrash his opponents. He prefers to toy with his victims first, and focus on intimidating them, likely probing their minds subtly to gain the information he requires, should he not have prior knowledge of who he is encountering. As the majority of his victims are high school teenagers who don't believe in this sort of hocus pocus, this isn't usually a problem. However, there have been times when this method hasn't been well suited to a situation that he finds himself in. Luckily for Krueger, he's usually smart enough to know when a more forward approach is required, which makes sense since he is also known to love a good fight, and therefore would be ready to use his abilities for that purpose when called for, the best example of which being his first fight with Jason Voorhees. For example, he knew the likelihood of intimidating Jason was slim, and as such, he opted to completely thrash him through the use of telekinesis. Of course, this didn't have the result that Freddy had hoped for, but this is due more to the ridiculous durability and resilience attributed to Jason himself, rather than any lacking ability on Freddy's part. Given the vast quantity of abilities that the Springwood Slasher has at his disposal, anyone who seeks to overcome him will be required to use the utmost ruthless creativity and power to overcome the shadow that is Freddy Krueger. For the most part, Torque's method of dealing with the monstrosities roaming Carnate Island and Baltimore revolve around conventional methods, such as the use of firearms and melee weapons, and this proved to be a reliable way of ensuring his survival, given his skills in this field. However, this is not what we are covering in this category. Torque has an interesting power set, and a rather unique one at that. So Torque, why don't you give the audience a demonstration of what you can do? Go on, go right ahead. When properly angered, Torque becomes pumped up on adrenaline and transforms into a hideous beast, possessing insane levels of physical and supernatural power. The appearance of this beast actually differs in its appearance. During his time on Carnate Island, the beast had one consistent appearance, being tall, with a clawed right hand, and a long sword-like blade replacing the lower half of his left arm. Whilst in his hometown of Baltimore, the right arm is instead bladed, and the left features a fist. The differing appearance is determined by what morality the player chooses to adopt when progressing through the story, i.e. good, neutral, or evil. However, there is no canonically correct version of the creature. While the neutral version does bear the most resemblance to the Carnate Island incarnation, Torque's fractured and broken mind leads me to believe that there is a possibility that given the outcome of specific circumstances, he could potentially transform into any one of these forms. The physical power that Torque is awarded whilst in this state is astounding. In fact, his fellow inmate Clem noted that he had seen Torque kill beasts with his bare hands, some of which were incredibly durable themselves, such as the Fester, which was impervious to gunfire. He could implement this physical might to completely shake the ground around him, causing devastating shockwaves, overpowering the vast majority of monsters in his vicinity. Included in this repertoire was his ability to summon various forms of explosive attacks, ranging from fire blasts attributed to the arsonist Malefactor, as well as differing cataclysmic blasts that could completely obliterate almost any living or non-living thing in its way within a rather significant vicinity. Furthermore, he could launch various spikes and chains out of the ground to lash out at his targets. He's been shown to summon cockroach-like monsters, known as wretches, to attack for him, and summoned a trio of mounted machine guns on his back to annihilate foes from afar. This extensive variety of power and lethality is what makes Torque's inner demon such a dangerous opponent, as there is no knowing what he may do next. Regardless of what morality the player chooses when playing the Suffering games, one thing remains consistent when using Torque's powers. They are employed with the intent of overwhelming his opposition through a completely destructive force of unpredictable power that will be immensely troublesome to take head on. This section is rather tricky. It's a case of Freddy's typical creativity and unpredictable variety versus Torque's overwhelming destructive force. While Freddy doesn't typically wield his powers in the manner that Torque does, this is simply because the majority of the time, he doesn't need to. Having said that, the vast majority of abilities at his disposal arguably have a more tangible benefit, as Freddy can likely copy Torque's own abilities, should he choose to. Granted, we don't know what other abilities Torque has, if any at all, but his approach to using his abilities has always been the same: savagely overwhelm. Should the need arise, Freddy can adopt a similar method of attack, and pull from a higher level of variety, but he will still be forced to contest with Torque's unrelenting offensive, which will make the contest extremely difficult, as Torque is simply the more aggressive of the two, and sometimes that can be all that's required to win. So while I am giving the edge to Krueger, the benefit of Torque's savage assault is not to be taken lightly. After all, it ain't stupid if it works. Freddy Krueger is given the edge for his powers.
Round 3.
Freddy Krueger is an unusual enigma. He is typically seen as a dream demon that is empowered by the fear of others. However, the fear of the general populace can only go so far. But Krueger's other main source of fear comes from that of the victims he targets, as the more afraid they are of him, the easier his job becomes. This is likely why he prefers to use your darkest fear, or some other experience that his victims have troubles dealing with, as he knows that they'll have a harder time dispelling him, making this process an endless cycle until the victim is finally deceased. This could also explain why he prefers to toy with you first, as while he does love a good fight, he also loves to feed on your terror and reap the benefits as much as possible. However, since Krueger appears in other people's dreams, they do have a chance to fight back. This is referred to as lucid dreaming, the concept of realizing you're in a dream and subsequently taking control of it. This is what has allowed his enemies to combat him in the dream world before, the most notable example being A Nightmare on Elm Street 3, The Dream Warriors, where most of the teenagers involved were able to use their imagination to influence their dreams and retaliate against Freddy. Of course, they did have prior knowledge from Nancy Thompson to help them, but it still shows that there are ways in which Freddy can be combated. But by reverse, almost every time something like this has happened, Freddy's enemies have been unsuccessful. But this ties over to the concept of willpower. They simply didn't have a strong enough will to overcome Freddy, as they just didn't have that sort of mental conditioning to overcome the evil will of Freddy's mind. It is possible to dispel Krueger from your dreams and send him back to hell, as we have actually seen opponents actually cause him trouble given the opportunity. On one occasion, a girl whom he had terrorized several times to the point where she suffered near fatal injuries, and she simply refused to die through her will. However, we simply don't see it very often because the majority of people he targets are easy pickings and don't have the will to fully overcome him. Overall, while Freddy's enemies can overcome and dispel him should they manage to muster up the mental strength required to do so, there is simply no denying that his purely evil mind will make this a difficult task to accomplish. The thing that makes the concept of Torque's ability so interesting is the fact that it is all implied to happen in his mind. To better explain this, I turn our attention to the journal entries of Clem and Carmen, as they seem to explain this concept rather well, albeit inadvertently.
The creature. I saw this creature in a dream, and it seems somehow connected to these horrific events. In my dream, I witnessed the inmate Torque transform into this beast and lay waste to all around him. Since the cataclysm, I have seen Torque go berserk, killing beasts with his bare hands. But of course, during such times, he himself does not actually transform into a beast. He merely becomes intensely enraged. The meaning of my dream, I leave for the reader to discern.
T has this thing, and I've never seen anything like it. I mean, anyone can tell you that he has some problems controlling his anger, but this goes way beyond that. When he was working at the gym sparring one time, I saw him lay into some guy like a madman. After a minute, T seemed to snap out of it, pulling back just in time. If he hadn't, I think he might have killed that other guy. It's like he becomes something else entirely.
According to the analysis of Dr. Killjoy, Torque's transformation actually happens in his mind, rather than in real life, as those around him have noted they have seen Torque go berserk, a problem that goes way beyond simple anger management issues. Throughout his life, Torque spent his years trying to hold this inner demon back. However, by the time of the games, he was required to call upon it more and more in order to ensure his survival. Killjoy would begin to encourage Torque to let out the beast within, and call upon his anger to best the monsters roaming the streets.
Now to work. If I'm going to cure you permanently this time, I'm going to need to make certain you explore your inner child. You're angry, child. To help us, I have found a strain of creature quite unique. To defeat it, you will need to use that inner beast, Torque. Let it all out.
Of course, this could be seen as a simple mechanic intended to make the player have a bit more variety in the way they play, but it also makes sense for Torque's story. If he can't hold the beast back, then he might as well try to make it useful. In fact, when Torque and Blackmore finally square off, Torque is only able to fight his alter ego when in this state, implying that Torque is more readily able to call on his anger to transform, seemingly at will. It's a similar concept to Bruce Banner as seen in the first Avengers movie. He trained himself to be able to transform at will, even if he's not completely in control once said transformation has taken place. But since this requires Torque to give in to his anger, the use of his willpower when in this state would logically revolve around how angry he is. The angrier, the better, as it would be even harder to dominate the mind of such a rage-fueled monster. Your best bet would be to try overcoming him early on, before he has a chance to give in to his rage. The thing that I consider to be the most interesting about this matchup is the fact that lucid dreaming occurs within one's own mind, but that is exactly where Torque's abilities manifest, meaning that they would become real within the realm in which he and Freddy will do battle. While we have not seen many instances of Freddy being overcome by the willpower of others, we have seen instances of him being temporarily put at a disadvantage due to a sudden increase in the willpower of his adversaries, some of which occurred due to a sudden angered outbursts that aren't anywhere near as explosive as Torque's. Many might believe that Torque's inability to properly tame his inner demon speaks to a lacking of willpower, and it is easy to see why.
But sometimes even the strongest will is not enough to hold back the demons inside.
However, in this particular fight, he will need to call on this beast if he even hopes to beat Freddy. As seen in Torque's story, Dr. Killjoy frequently encouraged Torque to quote, "let it all out," and give in to his anger. This is why I believe Torque's inner darkness to be his greatest asset in this fight, as he won't need to hold it back, and instead allow it to unleash itself with its full potency against Krueger. Freddy has shown that he can weaken the will of others through his intimidation tactics, but this isn't something that I feel would be of much benefit against someone like Torque. For example, Freddy wasn't able to install fear in Jason Voorhees until he accidentally stumbled across a potential weakness in Jason's will. Torque has arguably been through just as much emotional torment as Jason, even enduring his own rough childhood. And yet, whenever he is taunted about such events, the emotion he responds with is anger, not fear. Plus, attempting to enter the mind of such a rage-fueled monster will be substantially more difficult. While Freddy does have better control over his powers, the longer the fight progresses, and any continued attempt to make Torque cower in fear would just have the opposite effect, making his rage fuel the use of his power. A similar concept to how a Sith from Star Wars might use their anger to grant better potency and control of their abilities in battle. But there is of course a possibility that Freddy might be able to take advantage of Torque's fractured mind before his rage takes hold. After all, a mind like Torque's will definitely give Freddy a lot to work with, in both ways.
Final round.
Fear, death, chaos. Freddy Krueger and Torque were the epitome of these very concepts. A fight between the two will be a contest of creativity, but also their inner willpower. Will Freddy's will be too much torment for Torque to handle, or will Torque's rage overwhelm the Springwood Slasher? To set the stage, the environment will initially take on the appearance of Krueger's boiler room. Torque is not allowed to wake up unless he wins. Let's also say that his alternate personality, Blackmore, does not intervene. The verdict is a single explanation of one hypothetical outcome for a match that I consider the winner to take a slim 6 out of 10 majority. Unfamiliar with his new opponent, Torque attempts to gun Freddy down, mistaking him to be a new form of monster, yet not before Krueger gives a disturbing taunt. After a seemingly easy kill, Torque begins to walk away, only to find himself staring at Freddy's fixated and disturbing grin right before him. Confused as to what just happened, Torque is thrown back and forced to continue on. They would now engage in an epic battle of firearms versus reality warping. Torque is forced to fight incarnations of monsters and avoid the seemingly alive and now deadly environment. Frustrated and unsure of how he can bring this guy down, Torque suddenly hears something that initially annoys him, but then sends a chill down his spine.
What's the matter, Torque? You've forgotten how to kill. Come on, you know you can do better. And so does your family.
At that moment, apparitions of those he once called loved ones surround the convicted killer.
What is this?
One by one, they begin to torment him, and images of the past that remained an uncertain blur begin to flood his mind.
I could never love a murderer. How could you kill us? Kill Mom! Why, T? Why? I was always afraid when you were around. Sick bastard! Stay away, you monster!
Enough. His wrath brought to bear, Torque's inner darkness, once his greatest burden, now his greatest asset, reveals itself. Lashing out with undying ferocity, Torque throttles the Dream Demon, thrashing him with unrelenting strength, lashing out with chains, attacking with fire blasts. Freddy will put up his own offensive, retaliating with the environment as his weapon. This was no longer a nightmare, but a struggle for control. After several long minutes of trading destructive blows, Freddy will attempt to restrain the beast in front of him, ensnaring it with the surroundings. Attempting to pierce the monster's mind with the intent of shutting him down, Krueger finds his efforts unsuccessful. Now fully consumed by rage, Torque roars in fury, unleashing a cataclysmic explosion. Completely enveloped by the blast, Krueger vanishes, dispelled. Completely spent, physically and even more so mentally, but otherwise alive, Torque, the Tormented Survivor, is declared the winner. Well, that's it everyone. As always, I hope you enjoyed the video, regardless of any opinion on the verdict, as I'm sure many will be surprised by the outcome. In all honesty, I feel that this match is something that can go either way. I also feel that this match is the most open to interpretation out of all the versus videos I've done so far, and so I completely understand if you think Freddy would win. As I've said in the past, the primary purpose of any versus video on my channel exists to entertain those who watch, not to convert people's opinions. If you clicked on this video, then that implies that we share at least one common interest on something within the video. Debates are not the only form of discussion. Anyway, thank you all very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed watching this just as much as I did making it, and I'll see you all in another video soon. Happy Halloween!